Admiral Jack Morrison stood on the bridge of the battlecruiser Defiance and watched another star system fall to the enemy. The red dots on his tactical display told a story that made his stomach turn. 3 more coalition worlds had gone dark in the past week. The Vextai were winning and everyone knew it. Morrison had fought in space battles for 30 years, but he had never seen anything like this war. The Vextai moved through space like a plague of metal locusts. Their ships looked more grown than built, with organic curves and surfaces that seemed to heal themselves after taking damage. When coalition forces hit them with plasma cannons, the Vextai hulls would bubble and reform within minutes. The worst part was how predictable the battles had become. Coalition doctrine demanded massive formations of dreadnoughts moving in perfect lines. Every species in the coalition fought the same way they had for thousands of years. Form up in battle groups, advance on the enemy, exchange fire until one side retreated or died. It was honorable warfare that followed rules everyone understood, but the Vextai had learned those rules and found ways to break them. They attacked in swarms of smaller ships that moved like angry bees. When coalition dreadnoughts tried to target individual Vextai vessels, the enemy ships would scatter, then regroup somewhere else. By the time the heavy guns could rotate to track new targets, half the coalition formation would be burning wreckage. Commander Ryan Webb walked up beside Morrison and pointed at the display. Webb was young for his rank, but sharp as a blade. He had been questioning coalition tactics for months now. Most admirals would have transferred him to a quiet post by now, but Morrison appreciated officers who thought for themselves. "The enemy just took the Kepler system," Sir Webb said. "That leaves us with maybe 12 inhabited worlds still under coalition control. The Vextai have conquered everything else in less than 2 years. Morrison nodded grimly. He had done the math himself. At this rate, they would all be dead or enslaved within 6 months. "What bothers me, sir, is how we keep making the same mistakes," Webb continued. "We line up our ships like targets in a shooting gallery, then act surprised when the enemy picks us off. There has to be a better way to fight this war." Morrison was about to respond when alarms began screaming throughout the ship. Emergency lights bathed the bridge in red as tactical displays lit up with new contacts. Vextai raiders had found them. A dozen enemy ships dropped out of hyperspace just outside weapons range. They moved in that unsettling organic way that made Morrison think of sharks circling wounded prey. All ships assumed defensive formation, Morrison ordered. The coalition fleet began its familiar dance. Dreadnoughts moved to the center with their heavy armor and massive guns. Cruisers took flanking positions while destroyers spread out to provide screening fire. It was textbook coalition doctrine, and Morrison knew the Vextai would counter it perfectly. The battle began exactly as Morrison expected. Vextai ships scattered into multiple attack groups, then swarmed the coalition formation from different angles. Coalition gunners tried to track targets, but the enemy moved too fast and too unpredictably. Within minutes, 2 cruisers were listing badly, and the dreadnought Sovereign had lost half its forward batteries. Then something unexpected happened. The corvette Lightning had been cut off from the main formation when Vextai ships surrounded it. Instead of trying to rejoin the fleet or making a heroic last stand, the Lightning did something no coalition captain had ever done. It ran, but the Lightning did not just run away. It ducked behind a large asteroid, then popped out to fire at a Vextai cruiser before disappearing again. The enemy ships tried to follow, but the asteroid field was dense and full of hiding spots. The Lightning kept appearing from new directions to take quick shots, then vanish before the Vextai could respond. Morrison watched in fascination as the small human ship turned the asteroid field into a weapon. Every time Vextai ships bunched up to search for the Lightning, the corvette would appear behind them and rake their engines with particle beams. When the enemy spread out to cover more area, the Lightning would focus on isolated ships and pick them off one by one. The Vextai seemed confused by these tactics. Their ships kept trying to form up in their usual attack swarms, but the Lightning refused to fight on their terms. Instead, it used hit-and-run attacks that the enemy could not counter effectively. Morrison realized he was watching something revolutionary happen. 3 Vextai cruisers eventually cornered the Lightning near a large asteroid. The little corvette was finally trapped with nowhere to run. Morrison expected to watch the ship die heroically, but instead the Lightning did something even more surprising. It activated its self-destruct system and rammed the largest Vextai ship at full speed. The explosion was spectacular. Both ships vanished in a ball of white fire that consumed 2 nearby Vextai vessels as well. In less than 10 minutes, one small human corvette had destroyed 4 enemy ships using tactics Morrison had never seen before. The remaining Vextai raiders seemed shaken. They regrouped and withdrew without pressing their attack. After the battle, Morrison found himself staring at the tactical recordings. He played the lightning engagement over and over, trying to understand what he had witnessed. Webb joined him and they watched in silence as the small ship repeatedly disappeared and reappeared like a ghost. That was not coalition doctrine, Sir Webb said finally. That was something else entirely. Something older. Morrison nodded slowly. He was beginning to understand that humanity might have tactical knowledge the coalition had never learned. Knowledge that could change everything. Later that day, Morrison sent a priority message to Dr. Lisa Carter at the Coalition Research Facility on Titan Base. Carter was a brilliant scientist who specialized in understanding alien warfare patterns. If anyone could figure out what made human tactics so different, it would be her. The war was nearly lost, but Morrison had just seen something that gave him hope. Humanity had fought differently before joining the coalition. Maybe it was time to remember how. Dr. Lisa Carter received Admiral Morrison's message while working late in her laboratory on Titan Base. The research facility was hidden on Saturn's largest moon, far from the main shipping lanes where Vextai raiders might find it. Carter had been studying alien warfare patterns for 15 years, but Morrison's request made her think about something she had never considered. Before Carter pulled up the tactical recordings from the Lightning's final battle and watched them 3 times. The small corvette's movements reminded her of something, but she could not place what it was. She had studied coalition military doctrine extensively, but this was different. This was not how any civilized species fought war. That night, Carter accessed the archives containing human military history from before the coalition. What she found there shocked her. Humanity had fought wars for thousands of years using tactics the coalition considered primitive or dishonorable. Guerrilla warfare, ambush attacks, psychological operations, asymmetric tactics designed to let weaker forces defeat stronger enemies. The more Carter read, the more excited she became. Ancient human generals like Sun Tzu had written about winning wars through deception and misdirection. Medieval knights had used terrain to their advantage in ways coalition doctrine never taught. Colonial armies had defeated superior forces by refusing to fight conventional battles. Carter realized that when humanity joined the coalition, they had abandoned their natural way of fighting war. Coalition species preferred honorable combat with clear rules and predictable outcomes. They fought to prove their courage and skill, not necessarily to win at any cost. Humans had learned to fight differently out of necessity. The next morning, Carter contacted Colonel Sam Blake, who taught military history at the Coalition War College. Blake was an older man who had served in human forces before the integration. When Carter explained what she needed, Blake's eyes lit up with understanding. "You want to study irregular warfare," Blake said, "the kind of fighting we did before we learned to be civilized. Most people think those tactics are obsolete, but I always wondered if we gave up something important when we adopted coalition doctrine." Carter nodded eagerly. She needed someone who understood human military tradition. Blake helped Carter establish a classified research project called the Historical Tactics Initiative. They recruited military historians and retired officers who remembered pre-coalition warfare. The team worked in secret because many coalition leaders would have considered their research barbaric or wasteful. Meanwhile, the war continued to go badly. New Geneva fell to the Vextai after a siege that lasted only 3 days. The coalition fleet defending the system had followed standard doctrine perfectly. They formed defensive lines around the planet and waited for the enemy to attack. The Vextai simply ignored the fleet and landed ground forces on the far side of the planet. Captain Maya Torres commanded one of the evacuation ships that rescued civilians from New Geneva. Torres was a special forces officer who had trained in unconventional warfare before the coalition banned such programs. She watched coalition troops march out to meet Vextai forces in open battle and knew they would lose. The coalition army fought bravely, but they were completely outmatched. Vextai soldiers were larger and stronger than most coalition species. Their weapons fired faster and hit harder. Coalition forces tried to hold defensive positions, but the Vextai simply overwhelmed them with superior firepower and numbers. Torres led her evacuation team through the ruins of New Geneva's capital city. They moved in small groups using cover and concealment to avoid Vextai patrols. When enemy soldiers did spot them, Torres used hit-and-run tactics to break contact. Her team moved like ghosts through the urban landscape. During one encounter, Torres watched a squad of Coalition Marines try to hold a city block against Vextai attackers. The Marines formed a defensive line and traded shots with the enemy until they ran out of ammunition. Torres could have saved them if they had been willing to retreat and regroup, but Coalition doctrine demanded they hold their ground. That night, Torres sent a report to Dr. Carter describing what she had witnessed. Coalition forces were losing because they fought like they were still facing honorable enemies who followed the same rules. The Vextai fought to win at any cost. They used deception and overwhelming force without concern for military tradition. Carter shared Torres's report with her research team. Colonel Blake was not surprised by what he read. "The problem is we taught ourselves to fight like gentlemen," Blake said. "We follow rules that our enemies ignore. In the old days, humans fought dirty when they had to. We used every advantage we could find." The research team began developing training programs based on ancient human tactics. They studied guerrilla warfare techniques from Earth's colonial period. They examined siege tactics from medieval Europe. They analyzed naval strategies from the Great Ocean Wars. Every conflict taught lessons about fighting smarter instead of fighting harder. The breakthrough came when Captain Torres suggested combining ancient Roman military formations with modern starfighter tactics. Roman legions had used flexible unit structures that could adapt to changing battlefield conditions. Instead of rigid formations, Roman soldiers fought in small groups that supported each other. Carter realized that human psychology was different from other coalition species. Most aliens preferred predictable honor-based combat because it felt safe and civilized. Humans had evolved as persistence hunters, who used tools and cooperation to defeat stronger prey. They were naturally adapted for asymmetric warfare. The team developed what they called chaos warfare tactics. Instead of trying to outmuscle the enemy, humans would create unpredictable battlefield conditions that favored quick thinking over raw power. They would use deception and misdirection to make the enemy fight on human terms. Commander Webb visited the research facility to review their progress. When Carter showed him the new tactical protocols, Webb immediately understood their potential. "This is how the Lightning fought at Kepler Station," he said. The crew was improvising, but they were using instincts the Coalition never taught them. Carter nodded. Human military tradition emphasized adaptation and innovation over rigid doctrine. Ancient human commanders had been expected to think creatively and take calculated risks. Coalition doctrine tried to eliminate risk by making every battle predictable. The research team prepared a comprehensive report for Admiral Morrison. They had identified dozens of tactical concepts that could be adapted for modern space warfare. More importantly, they had developed training programs that could teach human crews to think like their ancestors. But first they needed to test their theories in actual combat. Carter proposed a small-scale operation that would demonstrate the effectiveness of irregular warfare tactics. If it worked, they could expand the program. If it failed, at least they would learn from their mistakes before it was too late. Admiral Morrison studied the target analysis while his senior staff waited for orders. The Vextai supply depot on Zirion Prime was considered impregnable by every Coalition strategist who had examined it. The fortress world was protected by 3 battle stations and a fleet of 200 warships. Standard Coalition doctrine would require at least 500 ships to have any chance of success. But Morrison was not planning a standard Coalition attack. Dr. Carter's research team had developed something they called Operation Trojan Horse. The plan violated every rule of civilized warfare, but Morrison was desperate enough to try anything. Coalition forces were down to their last 12 star systems, and conventional tactics had failed completely. Captain Torres would lead the most dangerous part of the mission. Her Special Forces team would infiltrate the fortress using captured Vextai transport ships. Coalition intelligence had learned that Vextai society was based on strict hierarchies. Lower-ranking soldiers never questioned orders from their superiors. The plan depended on psychological warfare techniques that Dr. Carter had found in ancient human military manuals. Most alien species, including the Vextai, had never encountered enemies who would deliberately appear defeated. The concept of deception in warfare was foreign to their understanding of honorable combat. Torres and her team spent 2 weeks preparing for the infiltration. They studied captured Vextai equipment and learned to mimic enemy communication protocols. More importantly, they practiced acting like prisoners of war. Coalition soldiers were trained to fight to the death rather than surrender. But Torres needed her people to be convincing captives. Meanwhile, Commander Webb prepared the diversion. Attack that would draw Vextai reinforcements away from Xerion Prime. Webb's small fleet would strike supply convoys on the opposite side of the system, then retreat before enemy forces could respond effectively. It was exactly the kind of hit-and-run tactics that had worked for the Lightning. The operation began when Torres and her team allowed themselves to be captured during a staged battle near the outer planets. Vextai forces found them hiding in a damaged transport ship with their weapons destroyed and their communications down. The enemy soldiers followed standard procedure and brought the prisoners to Xerion Prime for interrogation. Torres watched through the transport windows as they approached the massive fortress. Xerion Prime was covered with weapons platforms and shield generators. Vextai engineers had carved the entire planet into a military installation. Coalition intelligence had been right about one thing. A direct assault would have been suicide. But Coalition intelligence had missed something important. The Vextai were so confident in their defenses that they barely bothered to search prisoners. Torres and her team were carrying quantum mines disguised as medical equipment. The explosive devices were small enough to hide in their uniforms but powerful enough to destroy city blocks. The Vextai guards escorted them through the fortress complex toward the detention cells. Torres memorized the layout and marked locations where the mines would do maximum damage. She was particularly interested in the main power distribution center and the communications hub. Ancient human siege tactics emphasized cutting off enemy supplies and communications before launching the main attack. While Torres planted the mines, Webb began his diversion attack. His fleet dropped out of hyperspace near a convoy of Vextai supply ships and immediately opened fire. The enemy escorts were caught completely off guard. They had been expecting traditional coalition formations, not the scattered attack pattern Webb was using. Webb's ships attacked like a pack of wolves. They stayed in constant motion using asteroids and space debris for cover. When Vextai reinforcements arrived from nearby systems, they found no targets to engage. Webb's fleet had already destroyed half the convoy and disappeared into hyperspace. The Vextai commanders were confused by these tactics. Enemy fleets were supposed to stay and fight until one side won decisively. Running away after a successful attack made no sense according to their understanding of warfare. They sent more ships to hunt down Webb's fleet, but the human commander kept appearing in unexpected locations. Dr. Carter monitored the operation from her command post on the Defiance. She was ready to implement the most experimental part of the plan. Her team had developed what they called a psychological warfare protocol, based on ancient human techniques for disrupting enemy morale. Most alien species had never encountered anything like it. When Torres signaled that the mines were in position, Carter activated the protocol. Human ships throughout the system began broadcasting on all frequencies. The transmissions contained music poetry, mathematical paradoxes, and random noise. To human ears, it sounded like chaos, but Carter knew it would have a different effect on the air. The Vextai operated through a hive mind communication network that required precise coordination between all units. The chaotic broadcast disrupted their ability to share information and coordinate responses. Individual Vextai soldiers began making independent decisions without consulting the collective mind. Torres felt the fortress shudder as Vextai defensive systems began malfunctioning. Emergency lights flickered in the corridors and she could hear confused voices over the enemy communication systems. The psychological warfare protocol was working better than Carter had predicted. The Vextai were losing their greatest advantage. Morrison chose that moment to arrive with the main human fleet. But instead of the expected formation attack, his ships scattered throughout the system like angry hornets. They used unpredictable entry points and attacked wherever they found weakness. The Vextai tried to respond, but their coordination was breaking down. Torres detonated the quantum mines just as Morrison's fleet engaged the fortress defenses. The explosions cut power to half the weapons platforms and destroyed the main communications center. Vextai defenders found themselves fighting blind against an enemy that seemed to be everywhere at once. The battle for Xerion Prime lasted only 6 hours. Human ships darted between the fortress weapons like fighters in a dogfight. They concentrated fire on damaged sections and withdrew before the enemy could respond. It was nothing like the massive fleet engagements Coalition doctrine taught, but it was devastatingly effective. When the fortress finally fell, the Vextai had lost not only a major supply depot, but an entire battle group that had been stationed there. More importantly, they had lost something they had never experienced before. They had lost their sense of invincibility. News of the victory spread throughout Coalition space within hours. For the first time in 2 years, human forces had won a major battle against the Vextai. More importantly, they had done it using tactics that no one had seen before. Ancient human warfare techniques had been adapted for modern space combat with remarkable success. Morrison stood on the bridge of the Defiance and watched Vextai survivors fleeing the system. They were running in disorder without the coordinated movements that had made them so dangerous. Webb joined him at the observation window, and they shared a moment of quiet satisfaction. The war was far from over, but something fundamental had changed. Humanity had remembered how to fight like humans instead of trying to be civilized. The Vextai would adapt eventually, but for now they were confused and afraid. That gave the Coalition something it had not had in months: hope. The victory at Xerion Prime changed everything. News of humanity's tactical revolution spread through Coalition space faster than anyone expected. Within weeks, alien commanders from every member species were requesting human military advisors. The ancient warfare techniques that Coalition leaders had once dismissed as primitive were suddenly the most sought-after knowledge in the galaxy. Colonel Elena Rodriguez established the first asymmetric warfare academy on the moon orbiting New Terra. Rodriguez had served with human special forces before the Coalition integration and understood both old Earth tactics and modern space warfare. Her academy would teach alien officers concepts their species had never developed. The first class of students included officers from 12 different species. The Altarian Republic sent their most promising young commanders despite their rigid military traditions. The crystalline Zephyrians were particularly interested in information warfare techniques. The amphibious Hydrons wanted to learn environmental manipulation tactics. Rodriguez began each lesson by explaining human military philosophy. Most alien species fought to prove their honor and skill. Humans fought to win. This fundamental difference in thinking had shaped thousands of years of human warfare. Where aliens saw dishonorable tactics, humans saw creative solutions. The students struggled with concepts like battlefield deception and tactical retreat. In Altarian culture, running from a fight was considered cowardice. Zephyrian society valued perfect coordination over individual initiative. Hydran commanders had never learned to fight without overwhelming numerical advantage. But gradually the alien officers began to understand. Rodriguez showed them historical examples of smaller human forces defeating larger enemies through superior tactics. She explained how terrain could be turned into a weapon. She taught them to think like insurgents instead of soldiers. General Kevin Murphy led the first joint operations where human advisors worked directly with alien forces. Murphy had commanded irregular warfare units during humanity's colonial expansion period. He understood how to adapt ancient tactics for different species and technologies. The first joint operation targeted a Vextai listening post in the Outer Rim. Instead of a direct assault, Murphy coordinated a complex deception campaign. Human ships would create false sensor readings while Altarian forces approached from an unexpected direction. Zephyrian hackers would disrupt enemy communications at the crucial moment. The operation succeeded beyond all expectations. The Vextai garrison was completely surprised by tactics they had never encountered from non-human forces. Altarian commanders discovered that tactical flexibility could be more effective than perfect formations. Zephyrian officers learned to appreciate the chaos of battle instead of fearing it. Dr. Carter developed the adaptation protocol based on what she learned from these joint operations. The protocol was a training system that taught alien species to embrace uncertainty and creative problem-solving. Instead of memorizing battle plans, officers learned to improvise and respond to changing conditions. The protocol worked by presenting officers with impossible scenarios that had no correct solution according to traditional doctrine. Students were forced to think creatively and take calculated risks. Those who adapted quickly were promoted to positions of greater responsibility. Coalition Command was initially skeptical of these new training methods.
Many senior officers worried that abandoning traditional doctrine would lead to military chaos.
But the results spoke for themselves. Units trained in human tactics were winning battles that should have been impossible. The Hydran Third Fleet used environmental warfare tactics to trap an entire Vextai battle group in an asteroid field. Zephyrian information specialists learned to hack enemy communication networks using techniques borrowed from ancient human intelligence operations. Even the conservative Altarians began using hit-and-run tactics with devastating effectiveness. Meanwhile, the Vextai were struggling to adapt to this new style of warfare. Their hive mind structure was perfectly suited for coordination and overwhelming force, but it could not handle enemies who thrived on confusion and unpredictability. Individual Vextai clusters tried to develop counter-strategies, but their rigid hierarchy prevented rapid adaptation. Captain Torres led a mixed human-alien strike team that captured 3 Vextai command ships during the Battle of the Nebular Gates. The operation used stealth tactics, borrowed from ancient ninja techniques combined with modern cloaking technology. For the first time, coalition forces gained access to intact Vextai strategic planning computers. The intelligence gathered from those computers revealed something shocking. The Vextai had been preparing for a final assault on Earth itself. They viewed humanity as the greatest threat to their expansion and planned to eliminate human civilization completely. But the captured data also revealed the location of the Vextai home system. Admiral Morrison called an emergency meeting of coalition leadership to discuss this new intelligence. The Vextai homeworld was protected by defenses that made Zarian Prime look like a minor outpost. Conventional tactics would require the entire remaining coalition fleet and would probably still fail. But Morrison was no longer thinking in terms of conventional tactics. Humanity had taught the galaxy a new way to fight wars. Instead of overwhelming force, they would use adaptation and creativity. Instead of predictable strategies, they would embrace chaos and uncertainty. Dr. Carter proposed something that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. Instead of trying to match Vextai strength, they would turn the enemy's greatest advantage into a weakness. The hive mind that made Vextai forces so coordinated also made them vulnerable to psychological warfare on a massive scale. Commander Webb began planning the largest military operation in galactic history. But unlike traditional coalition campaigns, this one would not depend on massive fleets or overwhelming firepower. It would depend on thousands of small units operating independently using tactics their enemies could not predict or counter. The war had fundamentally changed. Coalition forces were no longer fighting according to ancient rules of honor and tradition. They were fighting to win using every advantage they could find. The Vextai were about to discover that humanity had taught the galaxy something more dangerous than new weapons or better ships. They had taught them to think like humans. And humans never fought fair when survival was at stake. Operation Endgame began at dawn on 17 different star systems simultaneously. Admiral Morrison coordinated the largest military force in galactic history, but instead of the traditional massive fleet engagement, coalition forces executed a plan based on ancient human military philosophy: victory through superior adaptation rather than superior firepower. Human fleets used quantum tunneling technology to appear throughout Vextai space at the same moment, but they did not attack in the coordinated formations that alien observers expected. Instead, they scattered like seeds in the wind, appearing wherever Vextai defenses were weakest. The chaos was deliberate and devastating. Captain Torres led the most critical part of the operation. Her strike team would infiltrate the Vextai Queen's fortress using stealth techniques borrowed from ancient ninja warriors. The team moved through the outer system like ghosts, using asteroid fields and space debris to mask their approach from enemy sensors. The Vextai homeworld was a massive hive, complex that stretched across 3 continents. Billions of warrior drones lived in perfect harmony under the direction of their queen. The hive mind that controlled them had never experienced doubt or uncertainty. Every Vextai knew their purpose and followed orders without question. Dr. Carter prepared to deploy the ultimate psychological weapon that her team had developed. They called it the doubt virus. It was an information pattern designed to introduce uncertainty into minds that had never learned to question authority. The concept was so alien to Vextai, thinking that their mental defenses had no way to resist it. While Torres approached the fortress planet, human fleets throughout the galaxy began their diversionary attacks. Commander Webb led a task force that struck Vextai supply lines using hit-and-run tactics. Colonel Rodriguez coordinated joint human-alien operations that appeared completely random to enemy observers. The Vextai tried to respond to these attacks, but their coordination was breaking down. Human psychological warfare broadcasts filled every communication channel with chaotic noise, ancient human music mixed with mathematical paradoxes and random poetry. The hive mind that had been their greatest strength was becoming a liability. Individual Vextai clusters began making independent decisions for the first time in their species' history. Some tried to reinforce threatened positions. Others attempted to coordinate counterattacks. A few even tried to retreat from battles they could not win. The perfect unity that had made them unstoppable was fragmenting. Torres reached the Queen's fortress just as Dr. Carter activated the doubt virus. The information pattern spread through Vextai communication networks like wildfire. Suddenly, every drone in the hive was experiencing thoughts they had never had before. What if the Queen was wrong? What if there was a better way to live? What if individual choice was more important than collective purpose? The Vextai Queen felt her perfect control slipping away as doubt infected her subjects. She had ruled for 1,000 years without ever being questioned. Now her own children were developing independent thoughts and desires. In desperation, she tried to reassert control by fragmenting the hive mind into smaller, more manageable clusters. But this desperate measure only made things worse. The smaller hive clusters began competing with each other instead of working together. Some clusters decided the war was pointless and attempted to negotiate with coalition forces. Others tried to continue fighting but lacked coordination with their neighbors. The Vextai war machine was tearing itself apart. Torres found the Queen's chamber deep in the heart of the fortress. The massive alien ruler was surrounded by thousands of confused drones who no longer knew what orders to follow. When Torres appeared, the Queen did something unprecedented in Vextai history. She asked for terms of surrender. Admiral Morrison received the surrender offer while coordinating the final phase of the operation. Traditional coalition doctrine would have demanded unconditional defeat of all enemy forces. But humanity had taught the galaxy to think differently about the nature of victory. Morrison proposed something that shocked every alien commander in the fleet. Instead of destroying the Vextai completely, Morrison offered them membership in a reformed galactic coalition. The fractured hive clusters would be allowed to develop as independent societies. Those who wanted to continue their warrior culture could serve as coalition military forces. Others could pursue different paths, including trade science or exploration. Many coalition leaders initially opposed this radical proposal. The Vextai had been their enemies for years and caused enormous suffering throughout the galaxy. But Dr. Carter argued that integration was better than extermination. The galaxy needed diversity of thought and experience. Even former enemies could become valuable allies if given the chance to change. The first Vextai clusters to accept coalition membership were those who had developed the strongest sense of individual identity. They formed independent governments and began establishing diplomatic relations with other species. Within months, former enemy soldiers were working alongside coalition forces as equals. The war officially ended when the last holdout Vextai clusters agreed to ceasefire terms. But the real victory was not military conquest. It was the transformation of galactic civilization itself. The coalition had learned that strength came from adaptability rather than rigid tradition. Former enemies could become friends if both sides were willing to evolve. 5 years after the war's end, Admiral Morrison served as Supreme Commander of the new Galactic Coalition. The organization bore little resemblance to its predecessor. Instead of enforcing uniform military doctrine, the coalition encouraged each species to develop tactics suited to their unique abilities and culture. Dr. Carter headed the Institute for Evolutionary Warfare, where beings from dozens of species studied not just human tactics but the fundamental principles of adaptation and creative problem-solving. The Institute's motto was simple but revolutionary. Victory belongs to those willing to change. Captain Torres commanded the first integrated special forces unit that included humans, Vextai, and 6 other species working together. They specialized in solving problems that no single species could handle alone. Their missions ranged from disaster relief to first contact with newly discovered civilizations. The galaxy had learned that strength did not always belong to the biggest ships or the most advanced technology. Sometimes it belonged to those willing to think differently about the nature of conflict itself. Humanity's greatest contribution was not their weapons or tactics, but their willingness to question fundamental assumptions about warfare and civilization. 3 years after the integration, program began. Long-range sensors detected new signals from the galactic rim. Something was emerging from dark space beyond the known star systems. The signals suggested a technology level far beyond anything the Coalition had encountered. A new threat was approaching, but this time the galaxy was ready. Human and Vextai strategists immediately began developing countermeasures. Altarian and Zephyrian scientists worked together to analyze the alien signals. Hydran engineers started designing new ship configurations based on lessons learned from the war. The old Coalition would have formed traditional battle lines and prepared for conventional warfare. The new Coalition began planning asymmetric responses before they even knew what they were fighting. They had learned the most important lesson humanity could teach. Always be ready to adapt. Morrison stood on the observation deck of the Coalition flagship and watched mixed-species crews preparing for whatever was coming. Human officers worked alongside former Vextai warriors. Ancient enemies had become trusted allies through shared adversity and mutual respect. The war that had nearly destroyed galactic civilization had instead transformed it into something stronger and more adaptable. Victory had come not through superior force, but through the willingness to evolve and grow. Whatever challenges lay ahead, the galaxy would face them together using every advantage creative thinking could provide. Humanity had rewritten the rules of battle and taught the galaxy to do the same. Now they would discover together what other rules might need changing in the endless adventure of survival among the stars.